Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no coping. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Hey everyone, it is April. That means summer's around the corner and we got to get in shape. We got to be working out. We got to take care of ourselves. You're doing the good work of mental health and enjoying stuff by listening to this excellent podcast. And, we have so many great guests and they're brought to you by Simply Snacking. So you might as well benefit that company for believing in us here and bringing this content for you. So buy some of their beef snacks and beef jerky and chicken and farm raised healthy good stuff. We're going to be talking about a lot of this on the podcast. You might as well know what we're talking about. So go and enjoy that. Have it. If you have Simply Snacking, keep eating it and enjoying it, and keep your lifestyle healthy. And summer's coming. We got to get ready. Don't say I didn't warn you. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening and enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome back to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. I had to drag this person on because her science is really intriguing and her products. And a lot of you may have heard me talk to William Davis and kind of open the bag of worms regarding the digestive system and microbiome and how it affects so many illnesses. And the more specialists I talk to, the more profound it becomes that there is definitely an impact from these little critters inside us that we think of as aliens or sounds so strange, but when you start looking at the science, it is astounding. So Martha, welcome. Martha Carlin, BiotiQuest, right? That's the name of your company, and Sugar Shift, which is a product I'm actually using myself and using it with patients now. I'm very intrigued by it, and I've seen some remarkable changes. So welcome. Tell people your story. How do you go from the corporate world to saying, okay, I'm going to start getting into the gut microbiome and figuring out disease processes and all that as a citizen scientist?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. Yes, actually, my early career was as a business turnaround expert. I have a degree in accounting, which I tell people is the original system, kind of the first system of recording balance. And back in 2002, my 44-year-old husband, John, was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And we went to the neurologist and they're like, well, you have Parkinson's, here's a pill. We'll see in 6 months. There's nothing you can do. It's progressive. It's just going to get worse. So it was like a real downer. And as a turnaround expert, I'm just not somebody who sits around and takes anything at face value. So I just started digging into the research. And at first, I was looking at food because I saw some connections. My husband was a marathon runner. I thought perhaps there were connections to the protein shakes he was drinking and, maybe pesticide residues, because there was some early evidence of connection to pesticides. So I first really started I said, I'm going to take a systems approach. And I was taught this method called transaction flow review as an auditor, where you just look at every transaction that flows through the system and try to figure out where the breakpoints are. And that shows you where the business risk is. So I just said, okay, I'm going to take that approach to the human body. And of course, the main flows through the system are food and water. So I spent probably 6 or 7 years really just studying deeply the food supply that we have and trying to go all organic, which back in 2002 was virtually impossible. And so then along the way, as I got deeper into that, I started studying, the Parkinson's pathology and protein aggregation and kind of all the pieces in the body, the mitochondria. And in 2014, I read a book by Dr. Martin Blazer called Missing Microbes. And that was the first time I had ever heard the term microbiome. And he was, he's an MD, PhD researcher, had spent a lot of his career looking at H. pylori and giving people antibiotics to get rid of H. pylori, but then discovered how damaging antibiotics are to the microbiome and what that was doing in terms of what they call non-communicable chronic diseases, diabetes, neurological, autoimmune, all these allergies, asthma. And it just really clicked for me. And shortly after that, I met a young guy who was a fermentation scientist who was had a company called Pure Cultures that was looking to get the antibiotics out of animal feed, out of chicken in particular. And so I invested in his company so that I could learn a little bit from him. And about 6 months into that process, researchers published the first paper that showed they could divide Parkinson's into the two primary phenotypes. So some people have tremor dominant and other people have posture and gait where you see them sort of the penguin look. And they were able to look at their gut bacteria, the microbiome, and divide them up just by their gut microbiome and tell which category they're in. And I said, that's it. The microbiome is like the general ledger in accounting. And so I quit my job. We sold our big, beautiful home and we started funding some research at the University of Chicago, looking at John's and my samples in time series, whole genome, because I was also wanting to tie genes I could see in the microbiome back to the food supply and what was going on with engineering in the food supply and reaction to chemicals. And through that process, I met a researcher at the University of Chicago, Dr. Jack Gilbert, he was a soil guy at the time. And he's like, why are you calling me? I was like, it's all connected. And anyway, we ended up connecting the dots because he had a child with autism. And then I was introduced to Dr. Suzanne Vernon, who was a virologist who'd studied chronic fatigue. And we started seeing how like all these diseases have microbiome triggers at their base and that there were likely some common elements. And so we started a company called the BioCollective originally, and we're collecting human fecal samples in a large database that we could also share with other researchers, share data that we could start to see multiple types of research on one sample and put that bigger picture together. And then that was 2015. In 2016, my husband has had some ups and downs, but he's doing remarkably well for having had Parkinson's for 20 years. And a lot of that is the food, nutrition research we've done. But
yeah, I want to look at let's talk for a second about the emotional aspect of this. You're 44 years old, you're in love with your husband, or he's 44 years old, and then you look and you go, was it like, oh crud, he's not going to make it long? Or was it like, I've got to fix this problem and I'm going to figure it out? Was it a resolve, or was it more like, this is a disease and I really don't like the term chronic progressive disease, because that's what we've said diabetes was. That's what we say all these health problems is chronic progressive. There's nothing you can do about it. You could just slow down the progression and say, well, I just don't like that answer if I've got a disease and I'm 44 years old.
I mean, it was pretty heart-wrenching for both of us. And for him, he didn't tell anybody about it for a while. He didn't tell anyone in his family. So, he was also keeping that inside. But like, I had this thing in the back of my head going, okay, he's not going to be around in 10, 15 years. And, I told myself, you've got to get over that. You're a problem solver. Just because somebody tells you it's going to be a certain way, through your experience in your life, I'm kind of a troublemaker. And so I really, probably earlier than John, kind of stepped out and said, okay, let's figure out how to solve this problem. Let's change the trajectory. Let's do something different. He talks about like sort of sitting on the window ledge, thinking about jumping, and the process of, reclaiming his life, and also, learning through this process with people with Parkinson's. It sort of follows that 80-20 rule. So about 80% of the people take that Parkinson's diagnosis and the progressive thing, and they just go sit in the chair and wait for it to progress and get worse. And then there's 20% of the people who are like us saying, what can we do about this? I'm going to exercise. I'm going to change my lifestyle. I'm going to, do the hard psychological work.
Yeah, word puzzles and things like that to activate your mind and all that. And it's the same thing with dementia, diabetes. I can name disease after disease where I've seen people just fold up the tent, say, I got this diagnosis, I'm done. I have cancer, I'm done. Instead of saying, okay, what do I do to fight this? How can I get myself in the best metabolic health I can to endure this thing? At least give me some quality of life for some time going on.
Sure. And in 2008, John met a researcher at the Cleveland Clinic. He actually met him doing the RAGBRAI, if you are familiar with that bike ride where they ride across the state of Iowa. And this researcher had discovered that with a friend of his who had Parkinson's, they had ridden a tandem. And it's, it's about 100 miles a day. And his friend said, when I'm riding the bike, I don't have my trimmer. And so he was a research scientist. And so he took that up and basically has been a pioneer in cycling, looking at cycling as a way to modify Parkinson's. So that reduced symptoms by about 35%. And my husband, John, got really involved in a group that was founded by Jay Alberts called Pedaling for Parkinson's. And they set up spin cycling programs in YMCAs across the country for people with Parkinson's to get together and, ride the spin cycle.
Yeah. And also what's interesting is that we know exercise, stress, exercise, all these things can affect the gut microbiome too. So that's one thing. And nutrition can definitely affect the gut microbiome. So that's why it's interesting that all these things kind of steer back to the gut microbiome. And I think in medicine, there's fights going on. Is it calories in, calories out for weight loss and diabetes, or is it hormonal only? And then you start saying, well, what about the gut microbiome? We no one's talking about that. And that's what's really intriguing, because these changes will affect the gut microbiome. For instance, if I say, okay, I'm going to give my patient 500 calories of food a day, I'm either going to give you gummy bears for 500 calories, or I'm going to give you salmon and vegetables for 500 calories. Who do you think is going to do better eating the same calories, right?
Yeah.
And you start realizing, the gut microbiome plays a role in this. And what we eat changes our gut microbiome also.
Well, that was interesting too, looking back, because we brought a lot of Parkinson's people into our sample cohort, and we're involved in a lot of activities. And so I'm always kind of interviewing people with Parkinson's about their lifestyle, like how did they grow up? Did they live on a farm? Did they exercise? And there's a fair percentage of them who were marathon runners. And so when I think about, marathon running in the, 70s, 80s, and 90s, I think it's maybe less so now, but there's still a lot of that, when they're training, they're carb loading, they're eating that goo that is, just glucose and fructose. And what that does is, converts them to a super sugar burner, as opposed to a fat burner. And I do think that had some metabolic effect on, the underlying drivers of what's going on in his system.
Well, and I'll tell you along those lines, I had a patient who was at the time, I think he was 165 pounds. He's a little bit old. He was in his early 70s and very fit. He was leading expeditions across the Grand Canyon. He was doing he was very fit, active guy, but he was carb loading all the time. So what was interesting about him, he was the first one that really made me sit back and say, what the heck is going on here? Because I'd never seen a healthy guy with six-pack abs pretty much getting diabetes. And so the lab called and said, yeah, his A1C is elevated. I said, that's impossible, dude. That's not right. Are you sure you got the right patient? I'm going to be very upset if I tell my patient this. And they go, look, we double checked. It's right. So I call him, his A1C is like 7.9 and his sugars are through the roof. I'm like, when the, so I call him, I say, hey, what are you doing? He goes, oh yeah, I'm going to change my diet, doc. I said, well, what the heck are you doing? He said, well, I'm leading these expeditions across the Grand Canyon. So I wake up and I'm having oatmeal and cereal and pancakes and syrup and orange juice. And then he takes 2 Gatorades with him and then he's drinking Mountain Dew. He's doing all this stuff to keep his energy up. He's carb loading because he knows that's what he needs to do. Then having pasta at night and bread and everything he ate was carbs. I was like, holy cow. So we changed his diet and within 3 months, his A1C was 5.0, right? Just from cutting out all the processed carbs, even though he wasn't, like, people don't understand is even if you're not getting fat, it's not you still have to spike the insulin to get rid of that sugar and shove it somewhere, even if you're burning it all off in your furnace of muscles because you're exercising. So that's a key thing with these skinny marathon runners getting Parkinson's and diabetes down the road. And, Professor Noakes, who's been one of the advocates in low carb, he noticed that. He said, "Oh, I used to tell everyone to carb load. Now I know I was giving bad advice."
Yeah. And I think that's still, we're actually going through right now. We got a glucose monitor for him and are looking at what's, we're just starting to sort of measure and look at, what's going on with his glucose. But, early in the microbiome process, I had some of his data, and I was talking to another microbiome scientist, and she looked at his sample, and she hadn't seen him. And she said, "Is he obese?" And I said, "No, he's actually quite thin." And she said, "He has an obese microbiome." So, there's that bacteria profile of obesity that is kind of tied in with, the carb diet.
And so people who don't understand this stuff, what's really interesting is I've seen the data, looking at, I'm thinking, ooh, the thing that stuns me the most is looking at getting into the science and the research is there. And you say, well, this is very clear. Like what you're saying is certain gut microbiome is going to, if you have Parkinson's, is going to look like this or this. And so you're missing certain gut microbiomes. There's data on rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, all these different diseases where the gut microbiome or psoriasis, where you're going to see certain changes in the gut microbiome. Say, oh, you're missing this and this. Why don't we add that back in? But what I'm wondering is, how come this isn't translating over to clinical, where us frontline docs are saying, hey, look, you have Parkinson's, let's try supplementing with this microbiota and this. Let's try to take out the processed food. Let's look at stress. Let's look at all these factors that are affecting the microbiome. It seems like none of that happens. They say, let's just throw a drug at the symptoms and see what happens.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons why that's not happening. The microbiome, most doctors are not trained on bacteriology or microbiology. So, when we started out collecting fecal samples from people, we do a very comprehensive whole genome report that it's about 35 to 40 pages. So it has bacteria, fungi, viruses, protists. It has antibiotic resistance genes. It has virulence genes. And, so we were sending them to the person who provided the sample, and a lot of them were taking them to their doctors, and the doctors' eyes just sort of cross over.
Oh yeah, you don't know what to do with that. Yeah, that is 35 pages. Forget it.
It's difficult. So I think we're at this stage now in the research where we're getting closer to understanding what key biomarkers are, and functional medicine doctors are better trained on understanding the microbiome, and, people like you who are starting to really look at it, or Bill Davis, and really understanding what are those key organisms that can help and what are the ones that can hurt. But it takes a decade or longer to get stuff really into the clinical, and it's not in the medical schools. I mean, there's research in the universities that are associated with the medical schools, but, it just hasn't moved into the mainstream. But I'll tell you, one of the things that we did find in doing some machine learning with our data was that, like, a small organism in a small amount can make a big difference. And that's what's so amazing about the microbiome. What we found was people who had species of Streptococcus, if they had more than 1% of their microbiome that was various streptococcal species, they were in a disease category. And if they had very low strep or no strep, they were in a healthy category. And that sort of went back to one of the things I found in talking to people with Parkinson's also early on, was many of them growing up as kids and into adulthood had multiple strep infections and taken many courses of antibiotics. And of course, then, the more antibiotics you take, the more you kill the good bacteria, the more, you just kind of have this vicious cycle of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the data shows. I mean, I've been looking at this study on the brain gut intercommunication, how your gut tells your brain when you're full, and if it's not communicating right, you're always hungry and you want to eat more and more. Then your insulin gets out of control, then you get insulin resistance, so it makes you even more hungry. Your triglycerides go up and they cross the blood-brain barrier and tell you to eat more. So you get into this huge cycle of problems. And so, you know, if we get back and say, okay, if we fix the gut, and this is why I'm really intrigued by your area of medicine, is this. You know, we see, you know, there's people who say, well, if you're obese, guess what? You could do all this stuff. You could have success for a little while, but then you're just going to be obese again. You're just going to go back to your old ways. And so you wonder how much of that, and there's data. I've been looking at the studies on what happens after gastric bypass surgery, balloons, what happens after you do a banding on your abdomen, what happens when you do these drugs for diabetes. All of those actually impact the gut microbiome and improve them. You get a diverse or intermittent fasting, all these things, stress control, improves the nature of the gut microbiome. But what happens is, after a while, like if we just talk about gastric bypass, after a while, your gut microbiome gets better. Then you say, well, I can sneak a couple of cookies. I'm going to drink a soda here. I'm going to do a little ice cream. I'm going to do that. And then all of a sudden you start feeding the bad bacteria again. And then they control your brain and make you want to eat more. And so people don't understand that cycle is like, okay, if I can keep that microbiome good or replenish the good stuff, that's not going to make me hungry and stressed out all the time. Because that's the other thing, is that the microbiome clearly, you know, with this lipopolysaccharide LPS, really can cause depression, anxiety, stress, and all this stuff. And if that starts leaking, like leaky gut that a lot of us laughed at for a lot of years, you start realizing, man, this can have a massive impact on health.
So, you know, that was also an interesting connection for me. There was a researcher in China who was looking at LPS and obesity, but I read his paper and I was like, well, this connects with Parkinson's. And then I sort of down the rabbit hole, you know, I find a lot of clues in reading the science papers about the models that they use. And there actually is an LPS induced Parkinson's animal model. So I'm like, why, you know, if you're making an animal get Parkinson's with LPS, why are you not asking yourself, how's this happening in a human? It's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, we see the data, we see it there in front of us, and we don't know what to do about it, or we don't have the will to make changes. And part of the problem in medicine is doctors can't sit down with their patients. I'm in a unique situation because I'm a direct primary care. I have more time with the patient, so we could figure these things out. But if you have 7 minutes, you just say, here's your pill, here's your pill, here's your pill, see you next time. Next patient comes in, here's your pill, we'll see you next time, we'll adjust the dose. Instead of saying, okay, let's step back, let's look, is there anything we can do in the gut microbiome? Is there something else we could do with life stress? Is there something, because in your husband's case, if he has an obese gut microbiome, the only reason he's not obese is because he's exercising enough to overcome that, right? So it's not showing that phenotype. But if he was sitting on the couch eating the same thing all the time, he would be obese and have Parkinson's, right? So it's very interesting how you can look at the gut microbiome, and it's kind of like reading your lifelines on your hand or something like that, where you can say, oh, I can tell what this person is. Like for me, I can hear your history and I can picture what that patient is going to be like when they come in the door. But sometimes it's surprising that, you know, I just have a young guy that's he came in and he had a heart attack at 40, runs in the family. And I'm expecting this 350-pound guy to walk in. I look at him, I go, holy cow, you're a fit, healthy looking guy. But I get his insulin back and it's through the roof, right? It's like, oh, okay, I have the answer. Even though your LDL and all these other things look good, you're metabolically sick and we have to fix this. Your triglycerides are through the roof. And, you know, we have indicators of bad disease that we have to fix to prevent damage down the road. But sometimes you can't just look at someone and tell if they're healthy or not.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest learnings out of the microbiome data is, you know, people can often look healthy and then I look at their microbiome and I'm like, and then I kind of generally say, you know, because we did a data set of 1,000 people across the population, 50% healthy and 50% disease. But, you know, pretty much everyone, because of our food supply, is somewhere on the spectrum toward disease because, you know, our food is so messed up.
And if we change our diet, how much of an impact can we have on the gut microbiome?
So it's pretty amazing. You know, the scientific evidence really shows you can shift it in about a week, a month of dietary change shifts it dramatically. But I think, you know, sort of back to your cheating comment, you know, you have your microbiome and that's your sort of core microbiome that's with you all your life. But what you're feeding it shows what's dominant. And so, they might sort of die out and hide in some sort of dormant state. And then, you go have a big piece of chocolate cake or something, and those guys are going to pop back up.
And that's exactly what we see clinically. We see people doing great on a low carb ketogenic diet, and then all of a sudden Christmas and holidays come and they have this cake, and then they're off the rails for 2 months, right? We lose contact with them if we're not contacting them and all that. And so that's what I was figuring, is like something's happening where you're triggering either the dopamine response in the brain or a combination thereof of satiety hormones. And so once they go back or they fast for a day or two and they get reset and they do great again, and there's like, okay, now I can handle not having these kind of foods, the impact. And as a matter of fact, along those lines, we just interviewed a gastroenterologist on our podcast yesterday, and we were talking about fecal transplants. And he said the crazy thing is, when you transfer fecal feces from one healthy person to someone who's morbidly obese, guess what? They stop craving, their cravings change dramatically, and they start craving the things that the other person craves, like pickles or other things and it's amazing that little bit can make that much of a change in your brain and what you want.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. On the dopamine side of things, what I found was really interesting. There's a researcher here in the United States named Mark Light, Lyte, who was really the pioneer with a British scientist, I can't think of his name right now, in a field called microbial endocrinology. And then he's paired up now with the University College Cork in Ireland, John Carlin. And so they've done a lot of work around how you get this, you can get these vicious cycles with stress brain chemistry, feeding certain microbes, and then that making more stress, and you just get this loop. But, in the process of reading his research and books, I learned microbes pretty much make almost everything, not everything, but, many drugs, vitamins, supplements, all of these things historically have been fermented by microorganisms. And, I found that there was a patent filed on the production of L-Dopa, which is dopamine, by a bacteria. And, it's just kind of interesting to me. So that's when I kind of shifted my brain to thinking about, okay, if we want specific neurochemistry or, metabolites, like how do we put back a mixture of the right bacteria that can actually make what we need, what we've lost, whether that's, B vitamins or, can they convert the sugars or, kind of taking that systems approach to putting back a working system into what I call your internal pharmacy.
Yeah, and it's just really fascinating where you say, well, can I make these little factories inside my gut that are going to make the right stuff and get rid of the bad stuff and convert it over to something I want? And so that kind of ties into Sugar Shift. How did you come up with Sugar Shift, and what was the reasoning behind it, and what kind of impact are we having clinically?
So the idea for that actually came from a Parkinson's meeting I went to. There was a group of citizen scientists, they're called Clinic Crowd, from Israel, who were presenting data from a scientist there who had shown that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the aggregation of the proteins in an animal model, and at even higher doses could actually pull those aggregates out of the brain. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So I came back and I bought a book on mannitol chemistry and started reading what an amazing molecule mannitol is. It's the most abundant sugar in nature. It is, a very high level in plants under water stress. So any kind of like a cactus or celery or a watermelon, so it helps manage osmotic stress. And I knew also in Parkinson's that there was an element of osmotic stress. This might be TMI, but in our lab, we processed the fecal samples, and our team in the lab actually said they could tell somebody who had Parkinson's just by looking at the fecal sample and knowing nothing else, because it was like concrete, no water content. So, I started looking at that, and the first chapter of the book was about the microbes that make mannitol and the microbes that use mannitol. And so I sat down with a fermentation chemist friend of mine and I said, can we make a formula to try this and see if we can put this function back in John's gut? And he had a lot of relationships in the industry, so we were able to quickly prototype something. And at the time, John was walking with a cane, and he was kind of having one of his down periods. And we made the formula in about 90 days. He started taking it right around Christmas time, and we were measuring his microbiome and comparing it to the healthy human microbiome profile. And what we saw was, so these microbes make the mannitol by converting glucose and fructose. So, it kind of restores the glucose 6-phosphate function that is also broken in a lot of people. I think about 1/6 of the global population. And his microbiome started moving back toward the healthy human microbiome profile, and he stopped walking with a cane. So 120 days later, it was still remodeling. We were watching how it was remodeling, continuing to remodel his gut. So then we had some samples. We started having other people try it, and, they were like, wow, I sleep better, my energy's better. And so we decided to turn it into a product. And in that process, I ended up with a few people with diabetes trying it and saying how it's impacting their blood glucose. And I was like, yeah, well, that makes sense, because it's working, we think, in the upper GI tract. And so it's removing that glucose and fructose before it has a chance to get down into the colon to feed the bad guys down there. And it's also potentially helping if anybody has some of the SIBO bacteria. But, I will say a caution, if you have really bad FODMAP issues, that it could cause some GI distress. But so then we actually are starting a clinical trial. Well, it started yesterday. We're actually doing it in Cuba. My chief scientific officer is from Cuba. So we have a 120-person trial in diabetes, and then a smaller trial in pre-diabetes. And we'll be measuring A1C, fasting blood glucose, postprandial blood glucose, and then we're having blood samples taken to send here to the States, because they don't have the ability to measure serum LPS. So there's a strain of bacteria in there that, after consulting with Bill Davis a bit, we think actually may help eliminate some of that LPS.
Wow, which is a huge deal, because LPS, I've seen it clinically here, where I start treating people for SIBO or parasites even. And all of a sudden they get depressed and anxious and stressed out. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, let's try some activated charcoal for a day or two and see what happens. Boom. The next day they wake up smiling and laughing. I've seen this more than once. I've seen it at least 3 times so far. And so it's amazing. People don't realize how your diet, gut microbiome, leaky gut, how that can affect, and so taking a step back, doing low carb and keto, the biggest surprise I had was all my diabetics are coming back saying, my mood's better. I'm laughing more. I'm not so serious. Things don't bug me as much. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. We're just changing your diet and we're trying to fix your insulin problem. But then you start thinking, oh, maybe the gut microbiome was changing, and maybe they're not leaking so much of this LPS toxin in, and autoimmune and joint. The other big surprise was joint pains getting better, inflammation. And so in talking with Bill, I was surprised that a lot of these meds we're using act on the gut and they're not even absorbed, and we're seeing, systemic benefits, right? So you wonder how much of an impact it has on the LPS and these kind of toxins that we're dealing with constantly.
So one of the things we think may be happening, we're trying to figure out how best to maybe verify that, but our formula has some unique strains. You don't see them in a lot of probiotics. One of them is Leuconostoc mesenteroides, and that's a strain that you often find in sauerkraut, but it makes something called capsule, which is, for a description for people, it's a sort of a gel-like, almost like a mucus, So one of the things we think is it may be making that capsule as it's going down through the GI tract, and that may be also helping to protect the gut lining for people who have lost some of their mucosal integrity.
And that's a huge point, is if we can increase the mucus layer, you know, there's things with there's some data out there with the collagen from bone broth helping, excuse me, green tea, the catechins, and you know, Bill's talking about cloves. I had some clove in green tea yesterday. So, you know, those kind of things you start looking and say, and plus, and I think the big thing is looking at the stress level. You know, I've seen that in obesity management, is that people who are stressed just do not lose weight as people who are just calm. And I've had people go on vacations and they lose 10 pounds just from not being in their stressful job and chasing the kids all day and checking their internet and just getting away a little bit, you know?
Yeah, well, I try to do this once a year, but it usually stretches out further than a year. But I have a Ayurvedic retreat that I go to in Northern California. And this year I actually went for 10 days and I did a 4-day dry fast while I was there. And it was just dramatic how much better I felt. And, you know, so I was relaxed. I wasn't stressed out from work. And then, you know, doing the fast on top of that, I came out of it with just feeling fantastic.
Yeah. And people don't realize that, you know, energy goes up and you feel better. Have you ever checked gut microbiome with fasting and see what changes over these short, like 4 days?
I did not do, I wish I had taken some kits with me so that I could test it. I'm actually laying the groundwork to do another one here in a couple of months. And so that's a really good idea to do. I do know they have shown, there is some research showing that fasting actually increases the diversity of the
Correct.
microbiome, because
I
think, yeah, that's probably because, you know, all the bugs in there are kind of going, okay, like, you know, we need to swap some genes. We need to figure out, like, how can we, you know, find the right food to survive.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Now, I a question I have about the mannitol. Is mannitol a non-absorbable sugar alcohol? So the effect is directly on the gut, which is interesting because I've had patients with Parkinson's who are taking exogenous mannitol itself. Is the effect on the gut microbiome that's helping the Parkinson's, or is it more, is some of it absorbed, or how what's the effect of that?
Well,
Other than in your case, you're taking away the bad stuff and convert it over to something that's good, and mannitol is nourishing to the gut microbiome, from what I understand.
yes, it does feed a broader profile of gut microbiome. Humans do not absorb it. So humans don't use it, but I think it may not be fully understood, because one of the other things I've found in looking at mannitol, so it's used in thermal energy storage. So mannitol and boron are also the circuit prime for the heart lung machine. So there's some electrical potential stored there. And now I forgot what I was going to say, but like,
Yeah. So and also, oh, go ahead.
it's so they mannitol is used, like, if you have brain trauma and you have swelling of the brain.
Yeah, that's what I was going to throw in there. We use it for trauma intravenously to decrease the inflammation in the brain with head trauma and strokes.
So there's a scientist in Japan that I talked to quite a bit, and he actually told me that mannitol causes a tsunami, like a flushing and clearing of the cerebrospinal fluid. So, you know, it's pulling that swelling out of the, and that's one of the things I also noticed with my husband. Sometimes if I was like giving him a head massage, I would notice this, like, you know, if there's like swelling, like you could push on his head and it was like squishy. So, you know, mannitol is osmotic. So it will also pull fluid into the colon. And that was one of the main things that people with Parkinson's, they probably have chronic, I think about 70% of them have chronic constipation 10 to 15 years prior to a Parkinson's diagnosis. And, you know, so I think that's really where we could have an impact on the trajectory and maybe keep people from getting Parkinson's by really understanding what's going on with that peristalsis and addressing chronic constipation. Because I think doctors, when somebody says I'm constipated or I don't go to the bathroom, they say, oh, that's okay. It's really not okay. You should be, if you're eating every day, you should be going to the bathroom and getting rid of that waste every day. So the mannitol does help, pull fluid into the colon and help with that. But we've also found people who had severe diarrhea, that it helped with the severe diarrhea. So, if you look at how mannitol works in a plant, it's an osmotic regulator. So, too much or too little, it keeps, that balance. I also think that part of what it does is pH modulation. Mannitol is a neutral molecule. And so I think it's also probably helping to modulate pH.
Yeah. And people don't realize that the constipation is a huge problem for people with Parkinson's. It's really a life altering, because they're in pain and they're bloated and they're taking all these meds trying to get it squared away. So maybe a little mannitol. Obviously, everyone, we're not giving medical advice here. That's clear. But it's those kind of things we have to look at and say, well, maybe I can do something to give me some quality of life, or hopefully extend life, and these kind of things that we can see as signs, like, oh, if you're chronically constipated, we better start monitoring you closely for some of these diseases that might come. Just like in my case, I'm looking at insulin levels, and it can tell me if your insulin is markedly elevated. I could tell you what's coming. We got to fix that problem. So, having these warning signs that we can, instead of trying to reverse a disease process, why not try to prevent it if we catch it early enough?
So that's also one of the things that we have been working on in Parkinson's with our data. We worked with a machine learning company in Poland and have identified microbiome biomarkers that could be translated into simple blood work that could, identify early risk. And we have another researcher here at DU that we're working with. He actually has, it's not published yet, so I can't tell you what it is, but he has basically been from a tiny amount of blood, been able to predict with 100% accuracy Parkinson's disease and the progression of Parkinson's. So how long somebody is in that process. And so there's some interesting things I think that'll be coming out there. And I work with him a lot between looking at blood and looking at the microbiome, and how, what's in the blood is often coming from the microbiome. And, another area that we've looked at is just sort of chronic low-grade infection, not just in Parkinson's, but in a lot of autoimmune and other kind of inflammatory illnesses. You get bacteria, the body, the immune system, like the M1 macrophages go in and attack it. That's the inflammatory phase, but it never quite gets rid of it. You get like the healing M2 macrophages don't come in and kind of finish that healing process. There's a researcher in California, I can't remember his name right now, but has looked at that broken healing cycle. And so then you always have this, bacterial debris that hasn't been cleaned up, which is, LPS, it's, it's cell wall components of all different kinds that are just constantly inflammatory.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing we're looking more and more. How much is this chronic inflammation problem? And then what feeds the chronic infections? Sugar. If you're on a high sugar processed food and you're feeding the bad stuff. So part of it's starving out the bad ones and feeding the good ones, right? But also just realizing, I mean, we've seen the data, and I think we make conclusions that may not be accurate, saying if people have chronic dental problems, they're more likely to have heart disease and strokes and all these kind of things. Well, is it the inflammation, or is it the chronic inflammation? Is it the immune response? And then we know a lot of our immune response, including COVID, comes from the gut. A huge percentage of that. So you have a really sick gut with a bunch of visceral fat sitting there, and you're eating terrible foods, and you're stressed out, and you hate life, and you're fighting with everyone. All these things play a role, and you're not sleeping because you're stressed out. And you look at how all this is interconnected, and it sounds so silly, but you say, gosh, we really have to look at getting the gut healthy. And I think that's what a lot of roads are. I had a great discussion with Bitten Johnson that just came out yesterday. As a matter of fact, she's an addiction specialist. She ties it all back to the gut microbiome also. So it's amazing how many good scientists are saying, we got to really look at that problem.
Well, it's, those opioid receptors, and there's connections even with some of the addiction type things in Parkinson's and the microbiome with Parkinson's. So another area that we're looking at too is how some of the bacteria, the immune system produces an antibody against the bacteria, and it's a area called molecular mimicry, where the bacteria has a little protein that is similar to the human protein. And so the body produces an antibody to that protein and starts attacking the human one that is very similar. And one of those that we've been looking at in Parkinson's is cardiolipin, which is the membrane of the mitochondria. And one of the elevated bacteria in people with Parkinson's is an organism that produces a cardiolipin. So
yeah, and then you start attacking yourself, and your immune system's working against you when it's wasting its resources on you rather than fighting the bad bugs, and that's a big issue also. So It's really intriguing how much we're coming back to. And I know you have several products. So you have one for post antibiotics. I know you have things in the works. So what are the big secrets that we have?
Yeah, so we have, we brought out the antibiotic antidote. We had worked on that several years ago, looking at various pieces of literature around what was going on in the microbiome after antibiotics. And so it's a well-balanced formula that helps modulate pH, because you don't want to just take a basic probiotic after antibiotics, because they're lactic acid producers. And so you'll get a more acidic pH that won't allow for a broader population of bugs. So, we designed ours to have a more modulated pH in the system to help restore the microbiome. We have one for heart health that produces nitric oxide. We have one called Ideal Immunity. That one has a gut-derived strain of bacteria that produces what are called bacteriocins that are very effective, 100% effective at killing listeria. They're also highly effective at salmonella and E. coli. So some of those foodborne pathogens that, particularly if you're eating at the salad bar all the time or eating out in restaurants, you're likely to get exposed to. So we have that one. We are actually bringing out a sleep product. Looks like now we won't get it until May because the supply chain's a little slow, but bacteria make melatonin. So this formula makes tryptophan and melatonin. So, and the working system lasts for about 7 hours. So you would take it right before bedtime, and the system would work producing that while you're sleeping, and then it would wear off by the time you get up. We've also talked to Bill Davis about making a SIBO yogurt starter, like he writes about in his book, because we've had so many of his people ask us, like, why don't you make a yogurt starter? So we're looking at that. And then we have another company called Paleobiotica that's focused on agriculture and makes products for the bioremediation of glyphosate and hydrocarbons and heavy metals out of the soil for plants, and also makes a plant growth probiotic. So we're bringing out a consumer, a yard size model. If you're growing vegetables in your backyard, called Yield and Shield. We're going to bring that out toward the end of April, because you need healthy soil and healthy plants for healthy food for a healthy microbiome.
That's awesome. You're doing so much great stuff, and it's great that you just didn't throw your hands up and say, okay, this is a diagnosis, we'll just take the pills and forget it. So you say, what can I do? And then what's great is the outshoot of that. And I can tell you personally, since I've been using Sugar Shift, I've seen my ketone levels go up, I've seen my sugars drop down, and it's very intriguing to me. And I've changed my workout, so I've confounded it a little bit. But it's really intriguing to say, oh, can this? Because for me, as a practitioner, I see some people doing everything right and they're working, and you know who you are, I know you're listening, and I see them doing everything right and they're frustrated, but their insulin remains elevated even though they're eating low carb and they're doing the right stuff. And so I thought, it would be kind of nice to see if we can help, if we can bind some of that stuff and change it into mannitol and take out some of the fructose and glucose from the diet and use it for a positive. is it possible we can get a better control of those insulin levels? And I think that's what I'm seeing in myself right now, because I'm very insulin resistant, by the way. And so you start saying, huh, can I intrude on that a little bit and maybe help out the progress on people?
Well, so I have a friend of mine from the Parkinson's research world, actually, who did a little N of 1 experiment. He's a vegetarian, so it's kind of hard for him to be real ketogenic, but he was really trying to address his borderline insulin resistance, and he's a big data guy. So he took like 40 days of data on his glucose measurements, and then he started taking sugar shift. And after 8 days, he saw the change in his fasting blood glucose. He eventually, through this, it was about an 8 to 12 week process, he ended up getting a CGM because he got so fascinated by it. But he was actually he was trying to do intermittent fasting, and he just was so hungry in the morning. He said, I just could not make it past noon. And then when he started taking the sugar shift, he said, I just wasn't even hungry. And, I would be fine until 2 o'clock when I had my first meal. And then he started to see that he was able to get to therapeutic ketosis levels on a vegetarian diet, which was,
that's one of our challenges. If I have a vegetarian, it's like, oh, it's going to be challenging. Will you eat eggs? Can we, to get you a good protein source. So yeah, I saw that testimony on your website. That was one of the things I was like, wow, that's pretty intriguing. So hopefully we can get some good science behind that and have some good anecdotal data, at least, to show, hey, look, I'm doing better. And especially for people who are struggling, because I think we hit that plateau and it's hard to get that insulin level down. But we're focusing on stress relief. Exercise is a huge factor in this. And I think using your product in conjunction with some different exercise techniques may be very beneficial for people who are kind of plateaued and are on the verge of giving up and going back and feeding the bad gut microbiome. So I think there's so much science. I think we're going to learn a lot. I think all of us working together, we figure out our little part of the puzzle and put it together to really help people.
Yes, we're very excited to get our clinical trial results. And that'll probably be August or September. We should have at least some of our preliminary results. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And then also I wanted to just quickly, I know we got to go, our hour's coming up quickly, but toxoplasmosis, can you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered about that in your journey?
Sure. So in the process of John has probably had more samples taken than anybody on the planet. And I was looking at his data on our dashboard. We worked with a company called Cosmos ID to do our sequencing, and the woman who founded Cosmos ID, Rita Colwell, is a world famous infectious disease expert. And so I was sitting at a conference looking at one of the samples, and Rita looked over at my dashboard and she said, whose sample is that? And I said, that's my husband's. And she said, well, that organism right there could be causing all of his problems. And I was like, really? So and it was Toxoplasma gondii. And so I end up kind of going down the rabbit hole of looking at toxo, and there were research papers in Europe connecting it with Parkinson's disease. There was a huge, pulling together multiple research meta-analysis out of the University of Chicago, tying it to all these neurological issues. And so I took the data into our internist, and he said, yeah, I'll treat him for that. So he treated him for 10 weeks with Bactrim, actually it was 6 weeks on Bactrim. And then I also took it because we were living together. And was really interesting. He was having some memory issues at the time, and his memory just cleared up. It was, it was amazing. Within, a week or 2 weeks, his memory was so much better. And of course, this is an organism that they say you get it from cats. We'd never had cats. He'd never had cats. But it's also, there are other sources for it, even in the food supply. So,
yeah, there's actually case studies of that. I think it was in Wisconsin where they got it in their water supply and it screwed up a bunch of people. right? So, and you don't think about it from mountain lions and whatever, these kind of animals that it's in their urine. And, toxo is a really interesting one because if you look at, anyone who's interested, go look at a YouTube video on toxo, and it's fascinating. The crazy cat lady could have toxo, and that's why she all of a sudden has 98 cats, and she likes the smell of cat urine and all that, and how it affects your brain. It's really, really interesting stuff.
So there's also the American Society of Microbiology has a podcast series like This Week in Microbiology, This Week in Virology, This Week in Parasitism, whatever. And that I was like, okay, it's a parasite. I'm going to go see if ASM has a podcast on it. And they had a 2-part series on toxo. And I was like mapping out all this stuff. And so much of it was connected to mechanisms in Parkinson's. My mind was kind of blown. And, I guess it's something that we should maybe test for periodically, because even if you treat it, sometimes
it's hard to treat, right?
Yeah, you may not get them all. So in my obsession to solve problems, I went out and bought the text of infectious disease. I have 2 volumes of all the various infectious disease stuff, and I dig into that periodically when I'm looking at somebody's microbiome, and I go, oh wow.
And so we could pick up toxo on a microbiome test
if you do whole genome. So
yeah,
you have to do pretty deep sequencing and whole genome sequencing, but you will pick it up if you do that.
And is there a like, as far as if people are curious that are listening, is there a commercial gut microbiome test that's not totally expensive, that's not like super labor intensive, that's something that people can get there? I know there's a few on the market, and they all have and Bill talks about in his book also, but I don't know if you have any that you go, oh, hey, this is a pretty good one for the most part.
So Microbiome Labs has one. They run their sequencing through Cosmos ID. And then Cosmos has a consumer arm called Nirvana Biome. And you can purchase a home kit there, and they do whole genome sequencing. But I don't know what the price on the Microbiome Labs one is, but I do think they do whole genome. And I think the one from Nirvana is about $250. So, the cost of sequencing, I think it's about a little over $100 to do what's called 16S, which only gets you a certain segment of the bacterial genome. And so, it's imperfect at best, but a lot of research has been done on 16S. I started out my company very focused on doing whole genome, because I think like most people don't realize the order of magnitude of genes from the microorganisms in your body is about 300 times your human genome. So so many of the functions in our body are performed by these organisms. And, so I was really interested in knowing the functional profile of what functional genes are in there, and what antibiotic resistance genes are in there, and what virulence. So, and you can't get that in a basic 16S microbiome test. But I do think both of those companies have some interpretive analytics that can help you, better be able to understand what's there. But they're still a far cry away from really giving you the active recommendations of,
Yeah, then what the heck do I do with the data, right? What probiotic do I take? Because so many people are just taking over-the-counter probiotics, or they're eating, yogurt that's been, fermented for a couple of hours instead of multiple hours or days. So it's those kind of things, saying, how can I replenish my gut microbiome and get the healthier stuff in there?
So that's one of the things I talk to people a lot about in probiotics. They're like, well, I'm at the store and I'm looking at the shelf, and
what should I get?
What should I get? And I'm like, well, most people don't realize this, but 95% of what's on that shelf that you're looking at comes from 3 main companies, and it's 12 or fewer strains. So, and they're selected for, production, ease of production. And so you're not getting diversity from just picking one off the shelf. And then a lot of manufacturers, the the product they make. They're just saying, okay, let me just put the most in there. Now they are starting to like give some more thought and look at, you know, how do we put some things together, but they don't do like what we do with a computational biology to understand how to really put together a working system. And then we go out and find strains that are unique. I mean, we do use some strains that are from the supply chain, but a lot of our strains, we've isolated ourselves from sources and had those produced for us so that they are unique. The other thing I tell people is eat fermented foods because, you know, fermented foods have communities that are already working together. So kimchi, sauerkraut, homemade yogurt. So like, you know, Bill Davis is recommending.
I just took mine off I just finished mine this morning, my second batch. It's pretty dang good too, I'll tell you. But
I make it with whole cream. It's like ice cream.
Oh yeah, it's so good. And I think the other thing is, and making yourself without all the preservatives, all the other garbage in there. If you're trying to make yourself healthy, you don't want to have with all these emulsifiers and all this other garbage that they throw in a lot of the products. And then also just figuring out how, you know, like for you, like some people I talk to and they're like, look, doc, I'm not going to eat kimchi, but you may have the bacteria in a pill someday. Go, here's your kimchi, here's your sauerkraut, here's your whatever. You don't have to eat it, but I happen to love sauerkraut and kimchi, so that's not an issue, right? Yeah. Kefir and, you know, all these, you know, dairy products that are whole, you know, unpasteurized, things like that, where you get these different, as long as it's from a reputable source, right, where they're checking it, they actually have it at Sprouts. So there's things like that we could do to help improve it. And I think, you know, as far as gut protection, I mean, have you looked into data on like bone broth or other things that might help the mucus layer of the colon?
So I actually make my own bone broth, and I make it, I use chicken feet because you get more collagen with that. And I also put in kelp. So you get you get the minerals from the kelp, and there's some.
And you get iodine also.
You're getting iodine. So you know, I use that quite a bit. I love.
You go to the store and I want chicken feet and kelp, and they're like, "What is wrong with this lady?"
Well, here in Colorado we have H Mart, and so they have all kinds of strange cuts of meat, and so you know, I just go there and get a big package of chicken feet, and then of course I'm moving to our farm later this year, and we have our own chickens. And last year I told my brother when he was doing the chickens, I was like, "Save me the feet." So.
Yeah, that's great because no one wants it. You go, okay, I'll take it. No one else wants it. You get it really cheap. You make some cheap soup.
My plan is to make like a giant thing of bone broth and freeze it. So
Martha, before we go, and you know, and also before this, how do people get in touch with you? How do they find your company if they're interested in trying your products?
Sure. So the company name is BiotiQuest. It's not that easy for people to pronounce, but sort of life quest, BiotiQuest. The product we were talking about is Sugar Shift. We also have heart-centered antibiotic antidote, ideal immunity, and simple slumber coming out. You can find us at www.BiotiQuest.com.
Yeah, and also for people with Parkinson's, there's a lot of good resources on there where you're looking at the science, and it's nice to have someone who's up on the science and the data and to have a source to go to.
And then I have a separate blog where I write specifically about Parkinson's, and many of those blog posts are about the microbiome connection to Parkinson's, and that's called Martha's Quest. So that's just my name with an S and a quest, marthasquest.com. And, you know, if you're really interested in the geeky microbiome science, the company that did the fecal sampling is the Bio Collective, and our soil company is called Paleobiotica, Paleobiotica.
All right, so you got all of our bases covered to get us healthier. So now I have to ask you on the way out, because this is life's best medicine. What's life's best medicine to you? What matters? What are things that get you motivated? What are things that you say, this gives me value in life, that I'm leaving a legacy?
For me, it is helping people. So I used to have a career that was all about like making money and, you know, moving up the ladder. And when I started doing this and seeing how much I can help people, and just even like the little interactions on the phone, that human connection, and really being able to make a difference in somebody's life. That's what motivates me to get up in the morning, and it makes me, I'm so much happier doing this and, you know, working to help people live healthier, happier lives.
And I will say, part of the reason I have you on, talking to you on this podcast, obviously, everyone, we don't have a financial interest at this point, at least. No, I'm just kidding. We don't. But, you know, I really want to help people and use products and help companies who are good people. And I will tell you, my office manager reached out to you and said, hey, my husband's having this problem. My kid's having this problem. And you personally reached back to her and gave her tons of information. Go look at this company, look over here, and trying to help and not just say, oh, just use our product and that's it. So I like people like that to say, hey, you have a bigger problem. Let's look at all these different areas and pull all these strings together. And that's what we need, is people are not just looking out for self-interest, because I think if you do the right thing and you have good products, you do well. But it's just saying, hey, look, there's other companies out here. Maybe you try this product over here that, you know, I like the person and they're doing good work also.
Well, I do tell people a lot, if they have a baby, there's a company called Evivo, Evivo. It's a California base, came out of UC Davis. And they have a specific organism that has been lost in Western babies that is really important, this bifidobacteria. And so I always tell people, if they're asking me, you know, I'm like, how old is your child? You know, look at this company, because they're doing amazing work. And, you know, if you're a new mother, if you have new mothers or people who are thinking about having babies that are listening to your show, they should definitely look at that product.
Yeah, especially if you can't breastfeed, because, you know, there's a big problem with the gut microbiome. And when we look at obesity and all these things going back, formula fed babies do worse than babies who do breastfeeding. Or if you had a C-section, they're going to be missing out on certain microbiota from the vaginal canal on, you know, during the birthing process. So there's a lot of stuff like that we never really paid attention to. So, you know, I think it's so important that we try to have healthier people. And, you know, and Bill was talking about people not having oxytocin to have reasonable conversations and see the other person's side of the argument, things like that. So it's really saying, hey, if I can replace that and be a nicer person and maybe not be on edge so much, that's going to help your journey, no matter what journey you're on.
Well, we have Bill's favorite bug in our Sugar Shift does have the Lactobacillus rhodori that he loves so much, that is the oxytocin producer. It's also a mannitol producer.
Yeah, so all those things are beneficial. And I have to ask you on the way out, can we put that into a yogurt?
Yes, in fact, Bill Davis's people have been making yogurt out of this one, and also out of the antibiotic antidote.
And is there a temperature it has to be at for us home chemists?
Well, you know, Bill does the lower temp, because I make it in my oven on proof temperature, which is 100 degrees. And that seems to work because the Lactobacillus rhodori at the higher temps will get killed.
Yeah.
But the antibiotic antidote one actually has Strep thermophilus in it, which is one of the more traditional yogurt cultures. So that one actually, to me, was a similar thickness and consistency to like more traditional yogurts. And if you listen to Bill and some of the people who talk, like they make a first round of the yogurt and then they use the, you know, like a quarter cup or something to make the next one. And the next one is not as, it has, the first round will sort of have curds in it, and the second round will be like a smoother, creamier yogurt.
All right, cool. Look at that. We got all the inside tips. We can make our own yogurt. It's so easy. I'm like, this is ridiculous. I booked out a night to make yogurt. Then I'm like, oh, I'm done. That's it. Like mix 3 things together and you're done. It's amazingly easy. And you do it just with heavy cream.
Yes. I you know, I was playing around because Bill recommends half and half, and I get this Guernsey A2 cream that is like super thick. And I thought, well, I'm going to try it with that. And we made that, and it was literally like eating ice cream.
Awesome. Awesome. Everyone, you don't have to be bored out there. Throw in some blueberries and strawberries and have fun. So Everyone, hey, thanks for listening. This is important stuff. This is really, I think that, go back and listen to this one, and go back if you haven't listened to William Davis, a great doc, talking about this stuff. And I think he's going to bring a lot of this to the forefront. So Martha, it's been great talking to you. I got to talk to you for an hour and a half on the phone over the weekend. Now we get to talk, again, so everyone can hear what we're talking about. And when you have new discoveries, let us know, new products, new things that we can do to help people. And the sleep thing is huge. So I know some patients I'll be recommending that to right away. So keep up the good work. And thank you for all your study and work and all that, and translating that into helping other people.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, and everyone, hey, be kind to yourself, be kind to others. Thanks for listening. And, share this information with people. I think it's good. Tell your neighbors and friends, or someone struggling with Parkinson's. This may be, life-changing for them. So, yeah, and then just learning and educating, and not just saying, okay, this is my lot in life, I'm going to die in 10 years or so, so just give people hope, and just be a positive force. And being nice to people helps your gut microbiome. Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information, and hopefully this helps you. Have a great day, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.